So, Cristiano, thank you so much for inviting me to deliver this presentation. Thank you all who are here now with us. I can see that there are 95 people here with us now. Thank you so much for your time and your interest. As Cristiano said, I'm a Brazilian interpreter. I'm also a translator, but today I'll make the best of my effort to focus on interpreting. And for for some years now, I've been paying attention to how racism manifests in language, especially racism against Black people. Considering I'm Black, I'm more, tuned to that, right? And I've decided to talk about it. I've decided to tell people, oh, those choice of words are not the best. And then I started delivering webinars and delivering talks, and here I am today. So it's the first time I deliver a presentation in English. I'm super nervous because English is my second language. But thank you so much, and please bear with me. The title of my presentation is Fighting Anti-Black Language While Interpreting to Brazilian and American Audiences. Telling you a bit more about me. I'm a conference interpreter. I'm based in Rio, but the Brazilian market allows for interpreters to travel a lot domestically. Considering that we're facing the pandemic, I'm not traveling at all. But in the past, I used to travel to São Paulo quite often to work. I miss São Paulo, to tell you the truth. And my working languages are Brazilian Portuguese and English, basically. I really want to work on my Spanish. It's one of my goals. And I would also like to add an African language. Swahili is a language that, took my heart away. So maybe one day I'll be fluent in Swahili. Guys, before we start talking about audiences, I'm going to provide you with a little background on Brazil. Basically, fun fact about Brazilians is that we love memes. And one of our recurrent meme is telling people to please come to Brazil. I know that now under the pandemic, this is not the case. It's impossible, almost impossible. But uh, this meme that you can see right here to the left, what great music, I should tell them to come to Brazil, is that Brazilian fans, especially Brazilian fans to pop music, they keep on sending messages to Ariana Grande, Justin Bieber, um, Lady Gaga, all day long, telling them to come to Brazil. So social media of those celebrities, especially pop celebrities, are full with hashtags and messages like, please come to Brazil. And I love this this little thing here, this meme. If you ever feel sad, alone, and completely unwanted, just remember that Brazil wants you to come visit. So please come to Brazil. And this meme on top, it shows the face of a very famous actress in Brazil. Her name is Renata Sorra. And she became, let's say, the queen of all memes, because most memes we come up with, we use her face. So this is important fun fact about Brazilians. Talking a bit about Brazil. Brazil is in Latin America, more specifically in South America. So if you've ever been to Colombia or Peru or even Chile, you were close to Brazil. So next time, please come to Brazil. Some key information about Brazil. Currently, the Brazilian population is 212 million people. And Black people account for 54% of that amount. When we say Black people, we consider people of African descent, Blacks, and light-skinned Blacks, basically. So it's important that we are mindful of language that includes over half the population of the country. Some background on the US for us to compare and contrast. Currently, the American population is 335 million people, and Black people account for 12.2%. When we compare the number of, and not only number and also percentage of Black people in Brazil and the US, the difference is stark. However, Black people in Brazil and the US, we share some similarities. Black Brazilians and African Americans, they are in the current territories that represent Brazil and the US because of colonization, and the process of colonization created slavery. And because of the transatlantic trade of Africans, Black people today live in Brazil and also in the US. Here in this picture, I've decided to use this picture because here we can see Lelia Gonzalez. She was a Brazilian intellectual, and she did amazing work in the 80s, and she was really she played a very important role for developing Black people's rights, especially when the latest Brazilian constitution was being drafted in 1988. Unfortunately, she passed away in the middle of the 90s. And Angela Davis. Angela Davis is an iconic African American who has been fighting against racism all her life, basically. Black Brazilians and African Americans, they have many things in common. An African DNA, African roots. We, Black people, raise our families and we believe in the future. We hold on to love to raise our families. We work hard because life is not easy. We also party hard. We create amazing music. We have to, survive racism. So we come up with plenty of strategies to fight against racism. It's interesting that African Americans, they do code switching all the time. African Americans, they also came up with Ebonics, which is a fantastic language I would like to be fluent in, maybe one day. And Black Brazilians, we also have to do some code switching as regards Afro-Brazilian religions. Afro-Brazilian religions, they keep some African roots by preserving African vocabulary, specifically nouns. And it's interesting that people devoted to to Afro-Brazilian religions, they don't talk about their religion when they're interacting in white-dominated environments. So this is a form of code switching and also a way to preserve the culture, to preserve religion. And also over the last 15 years, and especially over the last 4 years, there's been a rise in religious intolerance in Brazil, and Afro-Brazilian religions, they're the main target. Also, Black Brazilians and African Americans fight against racism ever since we've been in these territories, ever since we were forced to leave Africa, ever since the forced African diaspora started. And this forced African diaspora, the latest one, is linked to the colonization process performed by Europeans. One thing that relates to the colonization process and slavery is racism. Before the colonization and the, let's say, European domination in different continents, there were people who were enslaved, but it wasn't based on skin color. So people would be enslaved in regions that today represent the east of Europe, such as Romania or Poland. And it's interesting that the peoples from those regions, oftentimes the root of the term that describes them is linked to the word slave. And the fact that Africans were enslaved during European colonization of the Americas and also European colonization in Asia, Europeans had to resort to racism. They had to resort to the idea that based on skin color, you could establish a hierarchy of value between people, where white people are on top, Black people are at the bottom. So I selected this definition of racism because this definition has to go. We need to move on to a new definition, because this definition, it focuses basically on a belief that race is a primary determinant. And it also focuses on, let's say, a doctrine. But this definition that we can find in most English dictionaries, we need to let go of it and move on to a more complete definition of racism. Last year, in 2020, on the wake of protests after George Floyd was brutally murdered in the US, an American student, Mitchum Kennedy, she wrote to Merriam-Webster's dictionary to question their definition of racism. And I love the definition that she set forth, which is racism is not only prejudice against a certain person due to the color of a person's skin, as it's stated in the dictionary. Racism is both prejudice combined with social and institutional power. And racism is a system of advantage based on skin color. Of course, we know that not only Black people suffer with racism, there are different ethnic and racial minorities that struggle with racism. I'm wide aware of how Asian Americans are being mistreated now in the US and how they're facing a spark in racially motivated attacks. But considering that I focus on Black people, I would like to highlight this, that oftentimes white people come up to me and say, oh, I'm not racist. I have no prejudice against Black people. And then I say, you may think you never engage in racist practices. Great. But the fact is that you live in a society that has set up a whole structure of systemic and structural racism that keeps Black people at the worst jobs, living in the worst neighborhoods, and facing the highest hurdles to achieve their goals in life. And Black people face social and institutional control. And we can see that when we see mass incarceration, not only in the US, but also here in Brazil. When we see the fact that Black people are disproportionately targeted by the police and here in Brazil, killed by the police. The rate of police killing in Brazil is 23, every 23 minutes, Black youth, a Black male is killed by the police. And when we consider Black male, we consider a young Black man from 15 years old to 29. So the police has been killing us nonstop in Brazil. And oftentimes we say that Black people are facing a genocide in Brazil. And it's no exaggeration when we say that. So I just focused on this definition of racism for us to remember that it's not only prejudice against a person's color. We need to remember that there's social and institutional power involved. So, fighting anti-Black language. How can we fight racism by fighting anti-Black language? It's important that we pay attention, that because if we don't pay attention to language, we see things as natural. Racism comes, racism is at our face and we don't see it as a problem. So I'm going to provide you with 9 examples of anti-Black language that we should steer clear from when interpreting, and some suggestions of what to use instead. So starting with the N word, as you know, non-Black people, so non-Black POC and white people shouldn't be saying the N word. And if one day you're interpreting and somebody says the N word, don't try to use ofensa racista in Portuguese. Don't try to say one ofensa racista, one racist slur that you know in Portuguese. Why? Because we should avoid those words. The more we say racial slurs, the more powerful they are. So if somebody uses the N word in the context of interpreting, and that N word stands for a racial slur, so say ofensa racista. However, if you're interpreting a Black person who is telling a story and uses the N word all the time while telling a story, you can resort to interpreting to Portuguese as cara. I believe cara is a good option. If somebody's telling a story, instead of using the N word, you can use cara. And if the N word stands for racial slur in the context you're interpreting, just say ofensa racista. Don't repeat a racial slur you know in Portuguese, please. And the the next one, what I think that we should focus on is saying pessoa preta, black person, you know. Next one, words to steer clear, oh, steer clear of: escrava, avoid escrava, resort to escravizada, and slave, avoid slave, resort to enslaved. Why do I suggest that? The meaning, the idea that somebody has been forced into slavery is really clearly set forth in these words: escravizada and enslaved. When you resort to slave and escrava, it's as if that were natural for Black people. If it's as if that's Black people's place. So this slight change in language that while you're interpreting, if your audience hears enslaved, it's clear for them that a certain person was forced to be in bondage. If if your audience hears escravizada, it's also clear that a person was forced to be in bondage. So, cabelo ruim and cabelo duro are terms in Portuguese equivalent to bad hair. And this description is only, it's only for Black people's hair, right? I've never seen, well, because of Instagram and stuff, I've seen some white people saying, "Oh, bad hair day," but it's basically somebody who is too lazy to comb their own hair. But usually, when we hear bad hair, people are referring to Black people's hair in a very derogatory way. So steer clear of those expressions. And in Portuguese, it's best if you say cabelo crespo. You're on the safe side. And in English, instead of bad hair, curly hair. You're also on the safe side. This word right here, mulata, and the male equivalent, mulatto, this word I steer clear of because there's a stereotype in Brazil of attractive, light-skinned Black women who end up getting married to foreigners, especially European men, and then they are called mulata tipo exportação. And because of this stereotype, the word mulata has become really, really, really negative. It has very negative connotations in the Black Brazilian community. So it's best if you use parda or pardo. And when using parda or pardo, beware that you may referring to somebody who is mixed race, Black and white, or mixed race, indigenous and white, or Black and indigenous. So pardo refers to these three possible combinations of intermarriage and mixing race. This other word, mestiça and parda, a good translation for them is mixed race. I know that it's not really specific, like some people in Brazil, they resort to many, they break down those categories, but I believe that we're on the safe side if we keep mestiça, parda, and that standing for mixed race. Another thing, Brazilians usually regard brown people, for example, people from the Middle East. Uh, we tend to regard brown people as white. So when in 2016, the moment Syria started being a war scene and there were Syrian refugees all over the world, some Syrian refugees came to Brazil. I believe that some 3,000 people. It's not a very large number of refugees. And here in Brazil, they're treated as white. And when we compare the way Syrian refugees are treated to the way Haitian immigrants are treated in Brazil, because after the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, plenty of Haitians came to Brazil as immigrants. Haitians are truly mistreated because not only because they're black, but also because they're really like they're really dark skinned compared to black Brazilians. So, and also refugees who came from Congo, the ones who came to Brazil, they're harshly treated. And even refugees coming from Congo and Haiti who had qualifications, who worked as doctors, architects in their home countries. Here in Brazil, they're usually offered cleaning jobs, cooking jobs, and jobs in the civil construction sector. So coming back to the term, when we consider brown, because Brazilians don't understand very clearly the concept of brown and the concept of passing white, and passing white in Brazil is really easy to pass white. When you're talking about brown people, it's best if you specify the nationality. So if you're talking about Indians, say the nationality, don't call them brown, because a Brazilian may tend to see brown and translate into Brazilian Portuguese as pardo or parda. That's wrong, because people from the Middle East, they would dread the idea of being regarded as people of African descent, like pardos are. So don't translate brown as pardo. Focus on the nationality or the region. We know that brown is also a term that could describe Indian people as well. So focus on the nationality and region, not so much on skin color when we translate brown. And, you know, coming back to what I told you about the N-word, when telling a story, Brazilians have the awful habit of saying, especially when they're telling a story with a negative story or a story with a negative outcome. So the person who is going to get the negative outcome or the bad lesson is usually called nego or neguinho. And that would be like, neguinho would be like little black. And so people oftentimes Brazilians in general, not only white Brazilians, but Black Brazilians do that too. They're telling a story and somebody is doing something stupid or something negative in the story. So instead of saying the person's name, they say nego or neguinho. And what I suggest is to steer clear of racist language, we could say cara because it's usually an informal story. Cara is not that weird when when you're telling a story and you're trying to make it impersonal. And when we consider the English equivalent, guy or dude would do. This other term, negro de alma branca, I'm happy that lately less and less people are using it. But why is it racist and why is it problematic? Because when you say negro de alma branca, you're saying this Black person is only worthy because um, his or her behavior is connected to whiteness somehow. So this is so racist, extremely racist, because you don't see the person as an individual. You just see the person as a Black person who learned well how to act white, and then you congratulate that person. Black Brazilians usually call somebody who is a Black person who acts white or a Black person who is truly supportive of whiteness. We usually call them negresco in Black Brazilian slang. And two equivalents in English, we could say Uncle Tom, or we could also say that, oh, that nigga is acting white. But something that a Black person would say. These terms right here, POC has been a challenge for Brazilian translators lately, especially in when we consider the rise in discussion and in debates about racism in the US. And here in Brazil, Black people face racism the worst way possible. And I believe that in the US, Black people face racism in a terrible way, but Native Americans as well, and other, let's say, ethnic, racial minorities too. But when we consider other ethnic, racial minorities in Brazil, Asian Brazilians are not targeted by the police, for example. So they suffer racism, especially when it relates to stereotypes. But it's not like the fact that they're Asian is going to motivate police brutality against them or against their community. However, in Brazil, against Black people, that happens all the time. So translators have been having a hard time to translate POC into Brazilian Portuguese. I've seen many people using the term pessoa não branca. I have translated a book from English into Brazilian Portuguese. The name of the book is Intersectionality by Patricia Hill Collins and Sirma Bilge. And the publishing house told me to use that term, pessoa não branca. And Lelia Gonzalez, the one that I showed you in the slide with Angela Davis, she used to use the term pessoa não branca in her writings. I have translated some of her articles from Portuguese into English. But why pessoa não branca is not a good translation for POC? Because it places whiteness at the center of the narrative. And considering that we're fighting racism, that we want to see a world where Black people and people belonging to other ethnic and racial minorities are treated equally, we should not focus on whiteness. Therefore, I would rather use the term minorias étnico-raciais to translate POC. I know what you're gonna say, guys. I know that POC is an acronym and it's 3 letters. And when we're in the booth, especially working remotely, saying minorias étnico-raciais takes too long. I know, and you're absolutely right um, when your interpreter tells me that. I know, I I agree with you. Minorias étnico-raciais is super long, but this is the way that we stay true to the meaning of the acronym, and also we don't hurt ethnic racial minorities by not focusing on them and then focusing on whiteness when we say pessoa não branca. So we better stick with minorias étnico-raciais to have a more, let's say, inclusive language to Black people, for instance. And this next term, racializada, racialized, it does the same. It places whiteness at the center of the narrative because white people are not portrayed as racialized, but all the other ethnic racial minorities are portrayed as racialized people. For this reason, we better steer clear of racialized and focus on POC. So we can say POC. And we can also say in Brazilian Portuguese, pessoa de grupos étnico-raciais oprimidos, or minorias étnico-raciais. Those would be better translations for racialized. Again, I know it's long, and when we're in the booth, it's good to count with shorter solutions, but for now, those are the things that I've managed to come up with for good translations, and translations that are not going to echo racist ideas or overt racism. So those were my examples. I would like to remind you that racism is a pandemic. Now we're fighting against COVID, and for those who feel in their hearts that they should fight racism as well, so please join the struggle. Help us in the fight against racism. And we, as interpreters, we are the change, because when we change our language, our audience, even unconsciously, gets the change, and then they're going to change their speech. And when people change their speech to a less racist speech, they're going to change their actions, because they'll start treating Black people and POC as people, not as puppets or cattle. They're going to start treating people, POC, as actually humans. And when this change happens, then we're going to see a change in the structure of society, and people from ethnic and racial minorities are going to fare better in society, especially societies that have been structured by colonization and structured by racism. For this reason, choose your words wisely, because by choosing your words, you're going to influence people. Oftentimes, you're going to be the person pronouncing a certain word that your audience has never heard before. So you have a huge impact in your audience. So use this opportunity, use your power wisely, please. I'm open to the Q&A session, guys.